The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you all for joining us today for our sixth meeting of the Rate Review Advisory Group. We extend a warm welcome to our Rate Review Advisory Group members, as well as members of the public who are joining us today. Go to the next slide, please. All right. So our agenda for today will include a summary of requests and updates since our last meeting on June 17th, a summary of the planned approach for engagement around DDA's employment services, a discussion around future data collection to inform rate setting, and the sharing of preliminary findings from the recent data collection for our FY24 rate focus areas. Next slide, please. As we've shared with each meeting, Secretary Schrader and Deputy Secretary Simons the commitment to the development of adequate and sustainable rates, promoting the mission and vision of the DDA community. Your continued participation and contributions ensure an open, informed, and transparent process for reviewing rates. We go to the next slide, please. Okay, since our last meeting, we have several updates to share. First of all, thank you everyone for the feedback, just from members of the RREG on the policies that we shared. The feedback was helpful and has been accepted. To summarize, the feedback included clarification regarding specific statutes or code of conduct to ensure that we are correct about the intent behind who is to be regulated officially under these policies, allowing subgroups to outreach to provider representatives outside of the RREG membership, and qualifying the language regarding filling vacant seats as they turn over every 2 years and changing it to filling open seats as they turn over every 2 years. Also, at the recommendation of the Department's Assistant Attorney General, I also wanted to update that it's likely that the documents we've been reviewing will be released and published as an RREG charter. This recommendation considers that the document effectively details our objectives, our goals, and as well as the expectations and responsibilities for both internal and external members. Policies at MDH typically govern internal MDH processes, but we want this document to set expectations for all of us. I know this is a change in title again from our discussion from last month, but as it was last month as well, the substance remains the same, with the exception of what I told you about some of the feedback that we received. This recommendation feels right to me, so I wanted to share this direction and get your feedback. Any feedback on that? Okay. We will work to get this document finalized and placed on the RREG webpage shortly. We'll stay on this slide, but I will pass it along to Robert White, the DDA Director of Administrative Services, to share some additional updates.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer, for that first update. Since our last meeting, a meeting was held on July 11th. This was a follow-up meeting focused on a presentation request previously submitted by Max. This meeting was attended by the Max actuary, as well as Laura Howe, the Executive Director of Max, members of the department's rate setting consultants, and representatives of the DDA. The discussion was primarily focused on the fixed versus variable cost and acuity. And through subsequent feedback from Laura, we have discussed some needed next steps in order to further discuss and improve mutual understanding of the fixed and variable costs and options. And scheduling of these next steps are in progress, and we will update this group following those conversations. I also want to share that this valuable feedback identified the need for more open dialogue and opportunities for furthering understanding. And so moving forward, we will build in more time in the agenda for group discussion and listening, as well as to use smaller subgroup meetings when needed to take a deeper dive to inform any key areas. And this new structure and partnership is important to all of us, and we remain committed to ensuring a collaborative and engaged process. And I do appreciate your feedback around opportunities for improvement. And then just real quickly, an update on the fiat. I just wanted to confirm for members and for the provider community that we have placed 2 versions of the fiat on the RRAC webpage. We put both a locked version on there and an unlocked version, which was requested. And these are available as a resource for those providers who want to use the fiat for their own planning. And but if you have any questions on these tools, just send me an email. We're glad that they are supportive of your planning efforts. Jennifer?
Okay, so members were sent an email with meeting minutes on July 22nd. As chair, I will make a motion to approve the minutes. Would a member like to second?
Jennifer, it's Chris Parks. Before we approve, I've got a request to amend meeting minutes.
Sure.
There was a conversation that occurred on the video about 29 minutes and 50 seconds where Optimus provided a response to a question that both Sharon Lewis and myself had posed regarding lower utilization with respect to the charts that were presented for comparable purposes. The response from Optimus was that it's not something that sounded appropriate to do at the time, that if it was something that we were interested in talking about, if we felt that there was more reasonable projection, that it's something that can be entertained at the state level. I feel strongly, that was kind of missing from the minutes, but I want to just kind of add to that. I feel strongly that the scatter graphs that were presented last time, knowing that they included the 8% increase only in the LTSS rates, and utilization increases were shown on subsequent slides, don't really reflect all possible outcomes, and were skewed showing only positive potential changes. If we're going to look at the what if scenarios, I think we have to look at them all, not just the ones that support a particular position. I think we would be doing a disservice by not considering that provider utilization could be overstated. So I'd like to see the minutes be corrected to reflect the conversation, and also ultimately our request that the data be looked at with lower projected utilization.
We can certainly take that feedback. We'll go back and take another look at that part of the conversation, and we can also have some internal discussion on your more substantive request. And we will, of course, follow up to let you know any results of all of that.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. All right, any other comments on the minutes? Okay. I will now turn it over to Patricia Sestoki, the Director of Programs for DDA, to talk.
Jennifer, do you still need a second to approve?
Yes, actually. Thank you for pointing that out.
I'll make a second to approve with the amended change, proposed change.
All in favor of approving the minutes with the understanding that we'll go back and take another look at the particular part of the conversation that we were just discussing?
Aye. Aye. Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, thank you. And now I will turn it over to Patricia to talk about employment services engagement.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're having a wonderful Friday today. I know that the last time I shared in the last meeting that we were beginning to engage with a number of stakeholders around the DDA employment services. And so this slide kind of gives you a good overview of what we're looking at. As you can see, we're looking at engaging August next week all the way into November in reference to employment services. And so this engagement will include providers from the early adopters group, recent pilot providers currently offering employment services in Maryland DDA module, in the LTSS DDA module, and members of the Employment First Committee, and identify providers supporting individuals with more significant needs. Through this context, we will be collecting qualitative information around the rate and their policy experience across the new employment services. This information will provide us with a better understanding and direction for both policy and areas and rates. And any identified rate areas will be shared back with this group, the RAG, in the next cycle to inform rate setting priorities. So I just kind of want to make sure I want to close this out with you guys to know this is where we are. You know, our outcome is to provide an overview of an employment services and assumptions, identify current practices and experiences of stakeholders, and delineate feedback on rates and guidance and policy. So does anybody have any questions?
Patricia, I'm sorry, it's Laura. I was trying to figure out how to raise my hand, but I guess one thing that I'm not completely clear on is, and I know in the Employment First meeting, the first thing you mentioned was concern about the employment rates and coming back to the Employment First group, but can you just talk a little more about how DDA envisions getting, how are we going to make progress with employment? Because I know there's a lot of concern about it in the community.
Absolutely. No, so we really wanted to make sure that we had a good group of engagement providers. We figured the Employment First group has the folks that really are providing those services. And I'd asked that Employment First group, who are we missing from this group that are not here, that need to be here? And ask the group to please submit names so that we can make sure that the folks that were gathering the information are people who are feeling, touching, experiencing that. And that's why we're looking at the early adopters, people who are already in the LTSS Maryland module, and then those folks who have folks who have significant needs. They may want to talk about how the services that we put together may impact that. So we want to make sure we had a really good group. And the other piece is, if they were not already in that group, who were they, that we can get them to join so that we can have a really good, robust dialogue. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess in terms of Employment First, I just think we'll need to look at how that then intersects with this group.
So that's a good question. So one of the things that we're looking at, as I shared earlier, is we really want to look at, you know, the qualitative information around the rates. We wanted to look at their policy experience, meaning how are they implemented, carrying out the day-to-day operations with those services, you know, to milestone 1, milestone 2, ongoing supports, really get that knowledge. And if any of that information impacted or were identified as a rate concern, then we would bring it back to this group for to talk about it and to discuss, so that it be considered for the next cycle rate setting priorities. Does that help? So that's how it would I think bridge.
Okay, so you're saying rate concerns identified by Employment First would come back to this group.
That's correct. It would be identified so that we can bring back to this group so that you guys can talk about the next cycle to inform rate setting priorities.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions from any other member? Again, if you think, I think I know Laura, last time that we met with the Implement First group, shared that there were some people in there that we needed to make sure were invited and they were part of the original group. And then there's original members that are no longer there. So we need to reach out to see who's going to replace those. But we really do want that Implement First group to really have robust folks who really are delivering and providing those services so we can get some really good, qualitative data.
Tricia, this is Karen. I have a question. Are you intending to change the format so that we leave milestones and go to outcomes, or change to hourly, or is all of that on the table as a part of the discussion? And then will you be seeking outside support from experts in the field of employment funding?
That is a great question, Karen. What we were looking at is really look to see exactly what are some of the possible ways that we could include, different folks. And then also too, that we wanted to do a survey prior to how do we collect the information, because people may not have concerns with milestone 1, milestone 2, but I wanted to kind of do what I consider a baseline. And then look at all the employment service and ask basic questions to say, okay, milestone 1, are there any concerns, any recommendations? What is in the policy or process that it would create an issue? Then milestone 2, same question, employment, ongoing supports, follow along. All of the services that are under employment have like a baseline, and then from there figure out, okay, what would be the critical issue, and then hear out the group. And if we needed to have outside expertise or other states are doing this, then where were we at? But I won't know until I get a baseline of where we are with those groups and what some of the concerns that they're having.
Thank you.
Any other questions? But those are really good questions, and we'll make sure we'll put that. But I did share with the Implement First group what we're going to do. I think we are going to lead by group discussion, have it very integrated, and an opportunity to revisit everything related to employment services. All right, I think I don't see any more questions. So next slide.
All right. So one of the big items on our agenda today is kind of some initial thoughts around what data collection could look like in the future. So to kind of lead into that, we wanted to do a really brief recap of kind of rate setting process fundamentals to ensure we're all on the same page as we move into future rate cycles and begin the conversation around larger scale data collection and eventually rebasing. This slide and the next few slides provide context on the rate setting requirements, our goals, and the process. This is important as we work with you on the plan development and timeline to introduce a new data collection template. And see on this slide quickly the CMS requirements for rate setting. We have to rebase at a minimum every 5 years, include a description of the rate setting methodology and process, and we must ensure appropriate utilization, efficient and quality care, and sufficient access. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. So the approach to rate setting is a very structured, stepwise process. And as we are still in the first year of the RREG, we said we want to occasionally remind everyone of these steps to make sure that all members are comfortable with where we're at in the process and where we're going. Go to the next slide, please. And I will turn it over to Steve Schramm from Optimus.
Thank you, Jennifer. Just real quick, as part of the review of the rate setting process, this slide is to help people understand what we're going to do with the base data. So we collect the provider service data, and what we're trying to do is establish a base data set that represents a particular identified base data period, and then move it forward to the contract period. When we're doing that base data collection, the idea is that there needs to be some standardization in that, because not all of the providers are going to organize their information in the exact same way. So what we try to do is come up with a set of subcategories that we can use to standardize the data, much like we have done with the feedback around the rate setting that we've done so far to date. We are soliciting feedback during the process to make certain that this standardization has been done correctly and as consistently as possible. From there, those base data need to be adjusted because, as I said, it's for a particular base data time period, and we need to project it forward into a future contract period. And the way we adjust that is we control for things like policy and program changes, as well as trends that have occurred between the base data period and the contract period. The next step is to consider the administrative costs. We then combine the administrative and the programmatic costs into rates, and we ultimately then solicit feedback on those rates from the provider community. I'm going to now hand it to Kristen at Hilltop to talk a little bit about the data collection process that would be used as part of a rate rebase year. As Jennifer said, there are types of rate setting processes. What we're talking about is the rebase process that will happen, as Jennifer mentioned, within a 3 to 5 year cadence. So Kristen, next slide.
Great, thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the plan, timeline, and process for the rate rebase data collection. So as Steve mentioned, this will be collected for the rate rebase years. And I do want to, before we jump into talking about collecting the rate rebase data, there have been some questions about the cost reports and any changes to the cost reports. So we do want to clarify that the legislatively mandated cost reports for the reconciliation of the PCIS2 prospective payments are not changing. Those will remain the same. And on that note, there have been lots of requests in past meetings to provide updated templates and information on cost reports and the data that will be needed with some significant notice to allow providers to make the adjustments in their books and record keeping as needed. So we have started engaging in some preliminary steps for the planning and drafting of that general ledger informed template that will be used to collect the cost data to inform that rate rebase process. And so the rate setting data, which is typically the data providers input into the template from their general ledgers, will be collected from all providers to inform rate rebase years. Due to the level of detail needed during the rate rebase years, this data will not be collected annually. Based on some previous provider feedback and our experiences with collecting data in the past cycle, we understand it will take time to prepare in advance of the start of a fiscal year to align your cost reporting with the data collection. So we want to take the opportunity over the next year to review the template with the providers, engage in an ongoing feedback process, and to work with everyone to prepare to be able to submit the rate setting cost data. The template will be finalized prior to the start of the fiscal year when the data will be collected. And so a big key, as Steve mentioned, was having providers complete a standardized template. And so we understand from the last general ledger template process that it placed a large responsibility on DDA to do the groupings and manipulations of cost categories. So with the new process, we look to provide cost categories that are clearly defined and align with the cost categories that are used in the BRIC methodology for rate setting. And these will be similar to the cost categories used by Optimus during the previous review of the general ledger data. So we're hoping that providers will have some familiarity with these categories. The more detailed level of data available, the better it is to inform the BRIC and service level rate setting. And having the comprehensive detailed data could potentially limit ad hoc requests and inform priorities in interim years. So we're hopeful that being able to collect a very comprehensive data set will be allowed to be used to look at priorities outside of the rate rebase years. Using the standardized general ledger informed data collection template and process will help to ensure the consistency across the provider network. This will help us to collect data in the same way and also allow some uniformity in the interpretation of the data by both the providers and the DDA. With the process, there will be lots of opportunity for provider engagement. The goal is to give the providers the opportunity to review and provide ongoing feedback on the template over time, and then also to offer the opportunity to sample the template to providers who are interested in doing a sample test with the template. There will be a robust technical assistance piece of the introduction and review of the template, planning to work with providers over time to capture and be able to report cost data elements in the template, to provide technical assistance with the transition. So planned trainings, webinars to talk through the template, and available one-on-one assistance as questions arise for providers. And then we'll, share a rubric to realign expense categories. Right now, the timeline that we're looking at is to be able to share a draft template with providers following the end of the fiscal 24 rate cycle and working through the current priorities. So we are targeting September, October of this year, 2022, to start engaging with providers and share the template. And then there will be some ongoing discussions with a small work group during the off months of the rate cycle. So this would be September through December. And then to finalize a draft for additional discussion with the RAG in January 2023 as the next rate cycle kicks off. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can I ask a question before you go on? Just it might have been a slide or two back, but my question was just about the timeline for. You said that providers would have the data to be collected before the start of the fiscal year in which they're collecting it, but I would defer to some of the providers on the call on the group. I would just want to know how much time they actually need to get internal changes made to be able to collect data. So if it, if they got it the last week of June and they needed to start collecting data in July, or it was for that period of time, I just think we need to think through how much time do providers really need to be able to change their internal, whatever it is. If they're making ledger changes, that's going to be a big deal, just so they can plan.
Yes, I think that's a great point. And we certainly, as we start to engage, share the template and engage with providers, we're open to their feedback on, once they see the level of data that we're looking to collect, feedback on, timing and how much they'll need to be able to get in line with being able to provide the data.
Is there any plan to share that template with this group first before you start sharing it with the providers? And the second question is, you had said started sharing in September or October of this year. So does that mean there is a draft pretty much already in the works as to what that template would look like?
So we are in the preliminary stages of drafting that template. So we're really looking to be able to, in the most efficient way, collect this level of detail from providers. And so the plan would be to share the template following the end of this rate setting cycle. And so I know the group is still working through priorities, and we want to allow the group and providers to focus on the current cycle before sharing the template, since it's not something that's an immediate need. And I think we can be open to feedback whether the group would like to see the template first before engaging a small group of providers. And we can take that back to the DDA.
This is Chris. I've got a couple of questions and thoughts. With respect to the template sharing with this group, I would certainly say it cannot hurt. With respect to the data collection component, what are the plans when PCIS2 is gone? If we're not going to fully implement the new structure that we would utilize during a rate rebase year, if we're only doing that level of data collection every 5 years, I think we're missing a huge opportunity to continue to look at where things are headed. If we only do, if PCIS2 is gone, I've got the need for the cost report until PCIS2 is gone. I think that there needs to be something in all those other years, because I mean, after one rebase, PCIS2 very well may be completely gone. So are we going to use the new template in those years going forward? My fear is that if we're not, and we get to a rebase year where we have an anomaly again, like COVID, your rebase data may be completely useless. So I would encourage the group to consider the new template implemented as soon as possible. And I would say that you need to give providers at least 90 days before the start of the fiscal year. But that we continue to do that every year going forward, not just in a rate rebase year. Why would we not want to gather that data? And from a perspective of the burden that it puts on the providers, we're already putting that burden on the providers, asking them to continue to go back and pull data. I think they would rather have it upfront known, this is what I have to do, rather than having to go back occasionally and look at stuff. The amount of time to go back is costing more than it would to just go forward. But I think it's important that we would continue to grab the data for all the years, not just the rate rebase years, in the same format. I don't see a value to not doing that.
I think that's really helpful feedback. I don't think there was never an intention to do no data collection in non-rebase years. But I think you make some good points about that consistency that we should definitely take back and discuss them more internally.
I would even follow up with that and say that once the template is available, that it may be beneficial for some of the early adopters to look at it and attempt to fill it out. I mean, they're the ones that are already doing in this format, and give us that feedback. And we've got data sitting out there for the last 12 months that we've not collected in this format or in a format going forward that's usable. And I don't think we should lose it. I mean, I think we need to get something implemented as quickly as possible. So if you're talking October draft, I mean, are we looking at literally a 7/1/23 launch for that new format? And then that means, 90 days before that, so that this template and procedures and instructions and any policies associated with it would be given to the providers roughly April 1st of 2023.
So I think we, again, will have to go back and discuss that, because that wasn't kind of our original thinking, but it's something we can certainly go back and discuss. And I do think that and the consistency is important, and we do want to strike a balance between getting this in place as soon as possible and also having it be at a time of year that is feasible for providers to implement. So those are kind of the things I think we'll want to balance as we refine our schedule for rolling this out.
Thank you.
Can I just add one other thing, which is that I wonder if there is a baseline data that we want to collect annually, and there may be some additional data specific to rebasing years, either because of issues that we know have come up that, you know, warrant a deeper dive into certain issues, or because I think we want to balance. I agree with Chris. I had the same thought about annual data collection, but I know we also want to balance the demands on providers because there is more and more data collection for them. So, but that, I mean, once we see what the what it looks like, maybe that's one way to approach it.
Yeah, Laura, this is Greg. I totally agree with that. I was thinking the exact same thing, that we may want to look at a more comprehensive data collection mechanism in a rebase year that what we want in those 9 years is enough information so that there's not like major surprises in the rebase years. So almost if it's like a, you know, maybe it's a short form or something like that where, you know, we determine, I mean, we all know that when we look at our operating costs, you know, our direct care drives everything in our organizations in terms of cost. It's the, you know, our personnel expenses are the vast majority for all of us, probably 80–90% of our costs as an organization. So if we could at least keep, you know, major data points alive in those non-rebase years, I agree. I think that would be a good thing without it being onerous or over the top. So.
Okay, backtracking a bit. Kristen, had you had a chance to go through all of the points that you wanted to make about the cost categories, et cetera?
We flipped to this slide, I think, just give a quick rundown. I think our goal today was just to give a high level overview of the elements that will be included in that template. And so really just kind of driving home that it'll be a standardized, comprehensive approach to collecting service level expenses from providers. And this will include being able to break out expenses by region and by cost category. And so these are the cost categories that have been utilized in the past and help to inform the BRIC. So collecting data at the cost category level by service and by region, and then being able to have providers give a report of units by service and revenue by service. And when we talk about units by service, recognizing that some providers are doing services in LTSS Maryland, you know, and some in PCIS2, and for some it's a hybrid. So just being able to collect this level of detail in the cost data.
Yeah, I would also advocate and suggest that while obviously no situation is going to be perfect, that somehow there's at least enough flexibility to pivot if necessary, if there's a specific area. A great example of that for where we are currently would be transportation and the cost of fuel. You know, you do a rebase year, you know, and you end that year and you use $2 a gallon as your base, and then within 6 months it's $5 a gallon, and you're stuck in these places where it's like, well, we used the best data we had. I don't know the best way to do that. That's why we've got great experts here to help try to figure that out. But I think that if there are times, you know, COVID was a great example of major needed changes, but, you know, and hopefully, none of us will face that again in our careers. I'd like to believe that. I don't know if I do, but something as simple as a calamity, a major disaster, a war, something that affects fuel the way that it has over the last year is one that I think has all of us, I don't know about you guys, but when we tried to figure out our budget for fuel this year, it really was like throwing darts against the wall. Is it going to stay up? Is it going to go down? And yet we're stuck with those costs every single day. And the reimbursement mechanism may or may not help us to truly capture those costs. So whatever flexibility or pivot possibility there is in this, I think it would be good for everybody, so that the calamity of the day doesn't always dominate every conversation, because we don't have a system that was flexible enough to change with it.
This is Steve. I don't think the intent is to get rid of the process that we have now, where we do have the ability to solicit data on a regular basis. And so, Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, just like in the MCO rate setting process, they have a standard cadence asking for data when they do rate rebase, but they also have the ability, the capability of asking for additional information. And I don't think the intent is to eliminate that. So I want to make certain everybody's comfortable with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I was about to say was, Greg, I think the point that you made is exactly a good, kind of goes into why this process that we're engaging in now could be helpful in the future. Yes, we'll have these rebase years, but every other year we'll be meeting monthly for a good portion of the year like this, and we can discuss urgent issues that come up. And while it might not result in instant changes to rates, because we're always going to be data informed, there is that opportunity, if something's changed for any reason, to address it.
I think just and not going to beat a dead horse here. Thank you. I think that's incredibly important. Having been on the other side of this conversation in another state that said we're going to rebase every 3 years, but that doesn't mean that every year we won't have a conversation. Every year there was not a conversation, and the rebase occurred every 3 years. So I guess I'm just a little attuned to wanting to make sure that flexibility is in place. It sounds like that is certainly your goal and your intent. So I applaud that, because it's tenuous when you're being led by a mandate. And in Pennsylvania, this happened several years ago, where it was, it's going to be, we're only doing this because we have to put something in statute, but we're still going to be flexible. And there was zero flexibility ever in a non-rebase year. So I just don't want to see us get caught there.
Understood. I mean, as Steve alluded to, through in the MCO rate setting process, which is under different standards than this one, but we're trying to kind of take some of the elements we think work well from that and migrate it to DDA rates. We do have a process every year where MCOs basically submit their issues list, and we analyze all of them, and sometimes we agree from either a data or policy perspective, sometimes we don't agree, but it's always heard and looked at and considered. And at least my intention is to bring that to this process as well. Are there any other comments on data collection? If not, our next topic is some very preliminary results from the data templates that have been filled out recently.
This is Maria. I have one comment or question on the data collection elements. And this kind of reiterates, I think, Donna's point around engaging the providers early in this process. The cost categories, for example, I'm not seeing a facility on here, which I think is a BRIC category. So was curious why that's not on here. And then the other part is just making sure, knowing just how long it took for us to even get to a point on the transportation template that we were comfortable with, capturing that billable, non-billable time, staffing ratios, those sorts of statistics, and thinking through how we're going to use the data in the rate setting, how it's going to be used to inform, I think is super critical. So I'm glad to hear that you're looking at defining the data in very clear standards, but that does take a lot of time. And I think you would benefit greatly from engaging, a smaller group of providers to test the template before you roll it out in January.
Yeah, thank you. That's all great feedback. And I think the reason we're hoping to start this fall is to allow for that time for the engagement and feedback so that we can implement a good standardized tool.
And this is Sharon Lewis, and I'm not sure if this is the right point to ask this question, but I guess in this process, what I'm wondering is, where will the opportunity, and I think Steve, you talked to this a little bit about, in terms of adapting annually, but where is the opportunity going to exist to address issues that have been discussed and are not currently part of the template or this approach? For example, the issues of, acuity and the differences among different people and populations, and how that then plays out for providers within the rate. I know we've had some of those conversations, and it's been something that continues to be a concern, but it feels like it's not clear to me where that piece of the conversation will ultimately come into the discussion. Thank you.
Jennifer, are you okay if I try that one?
Sure.
So Sharon, part of the reason why we worked with Hilltop and MBH DDA to build the schedule for the RAG going forward and have the cadence that we've talked about is to allow us to begin to establish meetings where this is where we're going to talk about data collection. Then the next meeting, this is where we're going to talk about program or policy changes. And so the idea is to use the regular meeting flow to address that. And in past meetings, we have talked about, well, the intent of, and I don't have the schedule in front of me, so I apologize, I can't give the exact meeting, but we have said this meeting at the beginning of the year is intended to address program and policy changes. And so I think we have the beginnings, because this is a new process, of the framework necessary to solicit feedback at regular steps.
This is Chris. I'll just add to that. Oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
To build on what Steve was just saying, I think we, as we did this year, and I mean, we're kind of learning as we go with adapting to the DDA process. We'll start each year talking about, okay, what do we think are the major issues or priorities related to rate setting that we really want to look at. So that's kind of, this data collection is kind of our base. And then if we have specific things that we really want to look at beyond this base data collection, our reg structure provides a way to do that.
I guess I just and again, I will defer to the providers. I guess I'm just wondering, I know that several of those kinds of issues are not just policy issues, and I appreciate your comment, Steve, but ultimately will require, critical data collection from the providers that would intersect with what we're talking about here in terms of the standardized comprehensive approach. And I'm just, what I worry about is that if we have a discussion within this group and people say, yes, we need to understand better what's happening for individuals who have the highest support needs, that then we will, it will take 1 to 2 years to then incorporate that into any kind of data collection before there's information that can inform a conversation. So, and I hear everything that you're saying about, the plans and building these things into the meetings. I just wanted to raise that issue because I believe it continues to be a concern.
So, I mean, I think what we're working on right now is kind of an example of how this could continue to work going forward, although since it's our first attempt, it's not always going to be maybe as refined as it will be in the future, but Chris is going to be presenting next about our preliminary findings from the data collection that we just did to respond to the kind of rate priorities that we identified earlier in the cycle. So we are trying to respond to those more immediate issues as well. And it's kind of, again, trying to find that balance between being sure we're data informed and not taking 2 years to respond to something as well. I guess unless there are other pressing comments, I think this would probably be a really good transition for Chris, if you want to talk a bit about the preliminary data collection.
Jennifer, it's Chris Parks.
Sure.
Sorry, just one last thought. I mean, as we look at the entire data collection process, I think we really need to look at it as a 10-year strategic plan. What we, start to plan for the future. We're going to have several rebases throughout that, 10-year period. Let's look at it long term and then back into what we need short term, but let's make sure that we've accomplished everything that we need to accomplish over the next 10 years from a data collection perspective, and at least have that on the table or in the discussion as we start to finalize the current piece of it. You don't want to finalize the current piece and then
Absolutely.
5 years in we're looking and going, hey, we missed the boat on that. So what's the long term? And actually, I think I put it in the submission topics to literally, and maybe it's a RX subgroup or some subgroup that literally is creating a strategic plan for data collection for a 10-year window.
I think that's a point well taken, that that's something we can work towards, trying to figure out what is our regular cadence really going to look like and what's needed in various years, and then kind of layer on collection for specific issues on top of that. But no, I think that point very well taken.
All right, so if we move on to the next slide, we can start talking through some of the data that we've collected in this cycle. So not sure who's controlling that, but yep, there we go, thanks. So, we kind of talked through the process here that we were intending for our first meeting. After collecting that data, we wanted to give some preliminary results that we haven't had a whole lot of time to kind of look at everything. So, we had provided a date for providers to submit their data. Some asked for extensions, some submitted more after the extensions. And so what we have represented here is showing what we had as of Wednesday, July 20th. We have received, I believe, about 9 or 10 more since then. But as of July 20th, we had 59 providers submitting those templates. Some of them had shared the 2019 data, some of them shared the projection data, some of them shared both or just one or the other. And we have that breakdown there that's looking at the tabs and which tabs were populated by those providers. So I'll just point out that all meaningful day section there doesn't mean that they had populated every single one of those and it had combined or anything like that. There was a tab for all meaningful day specifically in place for providers that may not be able to easily split out between the various subgroups there. So as we start to look at this, and again, everything we're showing is just kind of preliminary, what we're seeing first pass. We're planning on doing some more analyses and talking that through with the state and sharing more detailed information in our next meeting. But as we look through initially what we're seeing, most of it is populated very well. There are some potential issues, in a few of them, for example, that DSP non-billable hours wasn't populated more frequently, as well as the non-wage transportation costs. And so we're trying to account for those things as we start, looking through all the details there. So on the next slide, we can start looking at some of the qualitative pieces. And so just again, kind of looking those through, we did have a tab on there for providers to share input, things that they were seeing, things they were expecting, or any information about the data they were providing. And so we've just kind of listed out some of the more common themes that emerged. And so just kind of running through that list, we heard concerns about inflation. It's been brought up in this meeting and past ones too, around gas and wages. Also, how weather impacts certain locations. There can be significant weather events. The number of participants was impacted by COVID, and providers may be projecting an increase in utilization as they see the pandemic hopefully kind of draw down a little bit more. There's also been a lot of concerns about low staff retention and talking about investments in the business models like transitioning to CDS. So it's just, again, kind of a brief summary of the information that we've received so far. As we move on to the next slide, we wanted to talk through some of our considerations that we're making as we're diving into those data analytics. And so there, we're really looking at the variances and assumptions that were made by providers when they're completing that tool. So again, those projections or any qualitative pieces that they put in there, trying to identify issues with missing values, any entry errors, where, for example, we saw someone put in an hourly wage instead of total wages when we were requesting that, and any obvious outliers. There's various ways we can try to look for those. So I think the next step is to start diving into our first piece, which is the staffing ratio. But just before that, I wanted to pause and see if there's any questions on just kind of the data that we've collected and the information we've shared so far. All right, and feel free to jump in with questions anytime, but we can keep moving on to the next piece here. We wanted to start talking through the staffing ratios. And so if we move to that next slide, what we're really looking for, kind of the question that we are trying to answer is, what is the average staffing ratio expected for the groups in meaningful day services? We understand, there's different groups for different sets of services, and it may not be a very easy question to answer, especially with the data availability that we have. But this is what we're trying to kind of aim for. So as we look at the next slide, we had collected some of those data elements that are shared here in this slide. And so, we've got those 4 lines there, which are asking about the individuals that are being served on a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio, the individuals that are served in total. I think I mixed those up in the order there. The number of staff providing those meaningful day services, and the number of staff providing meaningful day services on a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio. And so kind of first pass, there are some issues with how you can kind of interpret this. We've heard that feedback, we understand that. But first pass, kind of a general way that we're looking at this initially is, first off, taking that 1-to-1 ratio and 2-to-1 ratios. And in this example that we have, this is just hypothetical, just pointing that out there. But in this hypothetical example on line 2 and line 4, we see that there's 40 individuals receiving those services in 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 and 40 staff. And so that seems to indicate that it's generally a 1-to-1 ratio. Also, if we take lines 1 and 3, those ones are totals. They're inclusive of the 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 subsets. So if we take line 1 and line 2, for example, that 40 on line 2 is a subset of the 120 on line 1. So they're, in theory, if these were able to be completely discrete buckets, and we understand there's some overlap, you'd have about 80 individuals being served in a group setting. And similarly, if we look at the 3 versus 4, we have 60 staff total and 40 of them doing 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. Again, there can be some overlap, but initially that 60 minus that 40 tells us that there's about 20 staff. And so we look at that kind of on the bottom there, we have that 80 individuals per 20 staff, gives us a staffing ratio of about 4. Again, this is all just kind of hypothetical information. And we do understand that there is some noise in how this information is shared, and we don't want to necessarily take it 100% at face value. But this is, kind of a first pass to showing you how we are using that information. So we'll pause there and see if there's any questions or comments.
So you're using the term meaningful day and you're using data from 2019, correct?
Yes, so this is this specific slide has meaningful day. In the template, there were different tabs for day habilitation, for CDS, I believe employment services, and meaningful day all together. Additionally, those were 2019 data points, and we also asked for projections moving forward. So we do have both that data from 2019 and the projections, and we also have this split by service for the providers who are able to do that. But in this example, we are using meaningful day and we are using 2019 data. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, we start to see some of those kind of initial results. Again, we've received more provider responses since then. This is very preliminary, and again, we don't want to take everything 100% at face value, but just to give you kind of an idea of what we're seeing at the moment, we have this chart presented here. And so the way that this information is being shared, I'll just kind of give a little description. As you go across from left to right, on the bottom you see the range of 2 to 2.9, 3 to 3.9. So these are providers that said they had about that many individuals per staff. And the height of those bars, you can see kind of going up, is the number of providers that fell within that range. So the higher bars means more providers were there. This one specifically is that 2019 data, and this is for meaningful day providers. And just like we shared, I think 2 slides ago, this is pulling out the 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 and looking at what remains. And so just, again, showing preliminary results, what we're seeing, when you just kind of aggregate everything there, we're seeing an average staff ratio of 4.4. That is something that in the model, there are different staff ratios for different services. So this is not really something that is easily comparable to kind of what's built into the model, but just kind of more informational. If we look at staffing ratios that are for under 5, and we just look at that subset, we have that yellow dotted line there, and the average staff ratio there is about 3.2. And we look at the ones that are higher than that, then we're looking at kind of what might be more representative of a large group, and the average staffing ratio there is 6.7. On the next slide, we also have done the same thing, but we are looking at the projections. And so you can see that average staffing ratio came up a little bit higher. The small group and large group are, they're all relatively similar, but that distribution has moved a little bit. And again, this is for that all meaningful day. And so there is going to be some variance between the different services, which we can look at on the next slide. But again, wanted to pause here and see if there's any questions, comments, thoughts there.
Chris, it's Chris. Just one quick clarification. You've got small group here defined as less than 5. I'm had my head that small group is 1 to 2 to 1 to 5. So the 5 would be inclusive in the small group, as opposed to the large group, but we've got it broken out into the large group here. Can you clarify that, please?
Sure. And so when we're looking at these, I think, that's exactly right. If you're looking at a staff ratio of, let's say, 5.2, we're trying to identify, where would we bucket that? And so just for the way that it's represented here, we've kind of rolled that up into kind of above 5. I think it's set at 5 as the starting point there. I don't know that we had any that were exactly 5, but that is something that we're trying to consider. Also, again, with the data, we know there are some kind of imperfections in any data set that you collect. And one of the things that we had asked initially was to ask providers to populate information by whether it was a small group or a large group, and we heard some feedback that that would be difficult to do. So it's all kind of combined together into the number of individuals served and the number of staff. And so when we look at this, even though we're looking at, on this example, a staff ratio of 3.6 for what we've bucketed into small group, that isn't necessarily 100% accurate, because that does have some kind of blend of the small and large group, and similar story for the large group one. So again, we don't want to take these 100% at face value, but this is really kind of informative there on where directionally things might be leading.
Chris, it's Laura. I guess I'm struggling with what you just described, because I know there were flaws in the data. We saw some of the submissions from our members, and we know that there were some issues with them. But I guess in terms of data applying to specific services, we do have waiver definitions. So I'm struggling with why we would set group sizes if we're going to collect data and come up with some kind of average staff ratio by group size, why we actually wouldn't align that to the waiver definitions. Because then how do we then apply it to the different waiver services?
Yeah, and again, I think that was something that we had initially proposed in our template, was to have request that information by the group size, so it would be a little bit more discrete and directly comparable. And I know with trying to pull data back from 2019, providers expressed some concerns that having that level of detail might not be available. And so that was something where we had kind of simplified the template to allow for more responses. But to your point exactly, that that does kind of come at the cost of having that discrete, one-to-one matchup between the waiver definitions and the way the template was laid out.
So you're saying that the providers did not respond specifically to the waiver definition, small group, large group. Instead, you took what they responded to and I don't know, I guess I'm kind of I understand what you just said, but I'm kind of confused as well moving forward with this. I can't see why we wouldn't stick to that definition.
Can I just build on something Donna said? I thought from looking at this chart that you looked at, you have it all in buckets, and then the orange line that says large group equal or greater than 5, and that you then kind of made that its own distinct bucket. Why would you make that, even if providers didn't give you that data, but you clearly took their data and put it into these blue bars? Why wouldn't you then define the group the blue bars into what aligns with the waiver definitions?
Sure. So, I guess for representative purposes here, we didn't make that distinction. Again, if there, and to get back to the earlier question, again, that was something that we had requested on the initial template, and we heard, that feedback from the RAG members that it would be difficult for providers to split pieces out that way. And so that's why we don't have that in the data template that, finally was sent out. That was an initial draft, but based on those responses, we made that adjustment. And so if there is a provider here, let's say that has a staff ratio of 4 to 4.9 in this chart, they aren't necessarily providing exclusively small group services. They may be providing a mix of those two. So we're trying to get a little bit more information as we start to dive into that data. We're just showing kind of our initial results here. So we didn't necessarily want to say that someone with a staff ratio of 4 to 4.9 was exclusively small group. This is just kind of a summary of the information that is available at the moment.
Right, but couldn't you still set a dividing line? I mean, you chose 4 to 4.9 and 5 to 5.9. So why couldn't you choose a line that aligned with, I mean, you're saying if they fell between 4 and 4.9, they straddled two categories. Why couldn't you create a dividing line that aligned with the service definitions?
I guess I'm not really understanding that question so much. We did try to, there can be a little bit of noise around, how 5.0 is the exact definition. If someone was at 5.2, for example, that's, doesn't necessarily happen in any specific group. So we tended to believe that maybe that was more of a large group, but again, that's not something that's clear because there's no, I guess, 5.2 in the waiver definitions. So we don't have that specifically split out. We also don't know at the moment, and we're hoping to get a little bit more information, but we don't know at the moment if someone, again, has a staff ratio of something like 4.5, if they exclusively provide small group, or if they provide a mixture of small and large group. That's something we're not really clear on. So we're not necessarily trying to draw an arbitrary line that's different from the waiver in any way. We're just trying to present the information that's available and present some of those concerns and complications about how that data can be interpreted.
Well, I still have concerns, just to be on the record, and I have concerns about the choice. Because I understand from looking at some of what we received that it could be that there was a problem with the data, and I don't know how much anybody had time to go back and check with those providers to see if I mean, clearly there were some that seemed way off to me, and I don't know which ones you included, which ones if you took any out. So we don't know. Some of them may seem off because there was a misunderstanding about the data collection and how they completed it. And for some, it may be actual reflection of what they're doing. And so that's one issue, and I understand that, but I'm still struggling with why those dotted lines don't align with the service definitions. So.
Laura, this is Leslie. So I just wanted to say, when we were looking at the dividing line, we weren't necessarily looking at if somebody is in group 5 or less, that it's small group, because if a provider is averaging 5 people to one staff, they're more likely to have larger groups than they are to smaller groups. And the category right now, it says 4 to 4.9, but really we were looking at 4.999 all the way up to 5. And then anything beyond 5, we would include in the large group. I don't know if that helps answer that question for you.
I guess I'll throw this question back just to see if this helps at all. Is your question or concern that that line should start at 6, for example, instead of starting at 5? Just so I understand more clearly.
DHAB, yes. Yeah, that's what's in the service definition. Small group is up to 5. DHAB is up to 6. I mean, starts at 6.
Sure. So yeah, so that's one way that we can look at it. You know, again, there isn't a there is a break in the definitions from 5 to 6, and so there is some kind of arbitrary you know, way that you might look at something that's between 5 and 6. What we've shown here includes anything above 5 in that you know, larger group, because the small group ends at 5, and so the way that we had described it was anything above 5 would maybe be in large group, but it sounds like the way that you would prefer to see it is anything below 6 should be in small group, and so we can try to, you know, take a look at things both ways. That's just kind of, again, presenting information, a preliminary result here of what we're seeing at the moment.
Well, but I also think that the orange line is saying 5 and above is large group. So that is different from what I think you're saying. And maybe that's a typo, I don't know, but.
Yeah, I think that that might be just a really minor technical point. I don't know that we had any providers that were exactly 5.0. And so really that's going to be anybody above 5.
And then we also did it as a conservative measure because if we go through 5.9 to count as small group, that would increase the small group average, which we know is just not the case based on provider comments that were returned. And so we wanted to make sure that we built in some conservative measure there.
I have a question about the 9 and above, and I guess, Laura, since you looked at this, some of the providers' data, you may have some insight into this. You know, that's like an old sheltered workshop number. When I see 9 to 1 and above, that says to me, ooh, somebody might not have filled that out right. And I'm wondering if there's something like, I have a job coach who sees one person at a time, but they've got 9 people on their caseload. So that's why it comes up with 9 to 1. Because I just, you know, I've traveled the state and been in many different places. I feel like we'd be hard pressed to even find 3 people who have a 9 to 1 ratio anywhere. I don't know, maybe other providers do have that, but it says to me there's something wrong with the data when I see that.
Yeah, I think you've got some really great insight there. Exactly what we're seeing is this is all meaningful day, and so some of those providers had higher staffing ratios specifically in the employment services.
Oh.
And when we were seeing the qualitative comments from those providers, they were saying exactly what you're saying, that, you know, they might have multiple individuals served at different times by one staff member. So when we're starting to look at, for example, day habilitation by itself, we don't tend to see those very large group numbers. So this, we provided all meaningful day just because it's kind of all encompassing as a guiding point here, but we're looking at each of the individual services on their own in the same general way. So we have kind of those preliminary results and how they compare to the assumptions that are currently built into the model by service on, I think on the next slide.
Okay, yeah, so I think how we say this, you know, it's the number of people at a moment in time, not over the course of a person's week of the ratios. You know, I think that's part of the misunderstanding. As a state that is, you know, doesn't have a 14C any longer and has very few segregated employment situations, that data should reflect differently. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's some good insight and being able to interpret this so quickly. So yeah, appreciate that.
Chris, I'm sorry, can I just say one last thing, which is my concern is how this then gets applied and is it useful or not? You know, we've asked providers to take time to provide data. I just want to make sure that when we do that, it is that we both the request and how that's structured and then the analysis actually furthers this process. And I know I'm not the only one that feels this way. Some of the data that's been presented, it has not felt like it has really been helpful in terms of informing rates moving forward. And so that's why I'm raising this so much, is because I really want to make sure that if we ask for data, it needs to be, you know, usable. We need to, you know, give providers the time and, you know, whatever we need to do to make sure it's decent data, and then analyze it in a way that helps actually inform the services as they're defined. So I just want to be clear why I'm pushing this so much.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Laura, I'd add, this is Maria, that, you know, it appears, Chris, that all you have, you know, from the data is that average staffing ratio of 4.6 across all the providers, and that you're making an assumption around who might be small group, large group. And that, you know, I think to Laura's point, you know, that varies by service. So what a small CDS group is different than what a small group is defined by day is, and large group is only for day. So I think it's really important that everything balance back to that average staffing ratio, and you make assumptions, and you know, it's clear, and you should have this from the Fiat tool or other data sources, that you can better allocate that average staffing ratio to get you to a more appropriate small group, large group staffing ratio. Right now, I think based on how you're doing it, you may be overstating the small group and understating the large group. And, you know, we just want to make sure it balances back to the average staffing ratio. The other question I have is more of a technical question, but when you calculated your staffing ratios, are you using a weighted average or a straight average?
So, you know, we're doing just kind of preliminary results here. And so what we've shown here is just a straight average. That is something that we are considering. Just from your perspective, I don't know if there is a certain thought process that you have or concerns you have around a certain weighting. You know, there's the options of weighting based on number of individuals served or staff, things like that, or something related to revenue. Those are kind of pieces of information that we have, but just out of curiosity, is there a certain weighting that you think would be helpful to see?
In my opinion, a weighted average would be more appropriate, just because it's, you know, if you're trying to tie back to total staff and total costs, that's what's going to get you back, as opposed to a straight average. You know, I think it's helpful to look at both, just to make sure.
Maria, the question from Chris was what weighting? There's multiple opportunities for weighting. Is there a particular weight that you prefer?
Sure, it would just be adding up all the staff divided by all the members. So it would be the same math as you used to calculate the staffing ratio, just all added together.
Okay, so not revenue.
No.
Not revenue. You would suggest weighting on staff.
That's my opinion. Yep.
Helpful. Thank you.
So a lot of good questions. Again, you know, everything's kind of preliminary here. We're trying to look at it different ways and share those preliminary results, so that if any of you have any comments, thoughts on this, or feedback that you can share today or over the next week or two with how we should be looking at this. We're certainly open to any of those suggestions or thoughts, but again, wanted to kind of keep everybody in the loop as we start looking at this. So if we move to the next slide, we've done a similar look initially. Again, we are using that preliminary data set that we have. We have received more providers since then, and we are using the simple averages, which we may be looking at doing some weighted averages, and also, to Laura's point, maybe bucketing groups differently when we try to allocate, for small group versus large group, and see how those different results shake out, or trying to compare them. I think Maria may have mentioned to things like the Fiat tool, and see how that might play out. But just this initial summary, again, very preliminary. That first section there that's kind of highlighted yellow shows the assumption that's built in to the rate model. So essentially how the rates are developed. So for example, that CDS group has a 1 to 1.5, small group day habilitation is 1 to 3, and day habilitation large group is 1 to 6. Just so we're all on the same page from a math perspective, if you were to increase the denominator, so for example, that day hab small group from a 1 to 3 and change it to a 1 to 4, that would result in a lower rate. So anything that's higher would be a lower rate. Anything that's lower in the denominator would be a higher rate. So what we're seeing so far, again, using those simple averages from that preliminary set, in the calendar year 19 experience, we're seeing fairly close on the small group and large group. Both of our staffing ratios built into the model are slightly lower from a denominator perspective, which means those rates would be slightly higher than what that data is showing. The projected data shows fairly similar to what the calendar year 19 experience is showing. And we do have over there on the right the all meaningful day. There is no one staffing ratio assumption in the rates for all meaningful day. It's done at a specific service level, which is why that's grayed out on top. But just in terms of showing the data that we have, those are kind of the aggregate numbers on this first pass result. So I think that may be one of the last pieces we have on the staffing ratio. So pause there again to see if there's any other questions or comments regarding the staffing ratio data.
Chris, this is Karen. When you met with the early adopters group, when we had a CDS ratio for the LTSS rates, before we got the new April rates, we were at 1.29 or 1.31 or something like that. This was not the number you gave us at that point. So when you made the change and released it, you did not have 1.15. It was more like 1. Do you remember, Greg? It was like, and I'd have to pull out lots of old notes, but it was more like 1.78 or something.
Sure. So we can, go back and review that to make sure that that's correct and accurate. I know that there were different ways that information was reviewed. For example, some of the providers were reviewing the relative difference between CDS group and I want to say CDS 1-to-1. And there's various assumption differences, for example, in the wages between those two. And so if you don't account for those, I think some of that may have looked like it was a slightly different staffing ratio. But I believe this is the staffing ratio in the model, but that's, I think that's a good point. We can go back and double check that to confirm that that's, the way that it's being calculated is using this assumption.
Thank you. Because we had specifically had a long discussion about this, and I know as a result of our discussion, you made a change, but this I don't believe was the rate. I can pull out my old notes too, but it'll take about a week to find them. But
sure, yeah, and yeah, again, I know there was lots of discussion around there and different ways of comparing things that may have been, useful from different stakeholder kind of perspectives, but the way that we ultimately built it into the rates, I think this is consistent with how we've described it. But yeah, we'll come back to that and give an update and make sure that we are sharing that appropriately.
Chris, it's Chris. Can you go ahead?
Okay, I was going to ask Chris if I know you're maybe updating the data here. It would be helpful to know how many providers were used to inform each of these different staffing ratios, so CDS day, all meaningful day. From the earlier charts, it looked like you had 26 providers across all meaningful day versus the 59 that you said had populated the template. So if you could share the numbers of providers that were used to develop these staffing ratios, that would be helpful. and then your criteria for excluding, or, especially outliers. I'm honestly a little surprised at the CDS group, knowing that the upper bound of the CDS, my understanding is that's 4. To get a staffing ratio of 3.5 kind of points to maybe some data issues in how that was reported, or maybe just a small n, and you've only got some larger providers informing that particular statistic. But I think knowing how many providers and then your outlier criteria for exclusion would be helpful. And then I guess one question for you is, if there's an intent to go back to any providers that appear to be outliers or missing data to get some better data to inform these assumptions.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and those are pieces that we want to share. I know we've had some questions about how representative or significant the sample size is for each piece. So we're still kind of reviewing those incoming ones, and that's additional information that we'll be looking at and providing. And same thing, it's can be difficult for individual level data or provider level data to be shared more publicly. So we do want to try to be as transparent as possible, and so we'll provide that information around any sort of outlier exclusion criteria we had. I think, yeah, that's something that we will look at. We've been starting to look at kind of those qualitative responses to help identify whether or not the data were populated in a manner consistent with how we were interpreting it. I don't think there's been any intent at the moment to go back and ask for updates from providers, but that is something that we can consider if we think that that's something that may be helpful to do.
I definitely think we need to try and clarify the data that was used to calculate the 1 to 3.5 ratio in CDS. It just doesn't align with where you think it would be.
Sure, and I'm not intimately familiar with all of the ins and outs here, but I'm wondering also if that is something that could be similar to the employment services, where one staff provides services to different individuals at different parts of the day that might be potentially skewing that higher. But that's something that we need to start kind of looking through there and considering. I'm hearing some consistent and helpful feedback around that being a concern. So that's definitely something we'll try to look into a little bit deeper and get a better understanding of.
And just to make sure that we have time to talk through the transportation piece, we'll take some last comments if there's any, but otherwise we'll move on to the transportation part of the data collection. So just like staffing ratio, when in our prior conversations we talked about trying to answer the question of what proportion of the time and resources does non-billable transportation represent relative to the wages. And so that's where we're looking at utilizing the information that we were able to collect to help us answer that question. If we go on to the next slide, on here is an example of what a response would look like for us. We asked for the total DSP billable hours, non-billable hours that are transportation, and then all other non-billable hours. And then we also asked for non-wage costs and versus the DSP wage. So the top portion of this, we divided into what we call the time component. And so we were able to calculate by taking the total DSP non-billable hours and dividing by the total hours paid to employees, which is the combination of all three lines 1 through 3. In this example, which are sample numbers only, we get a 19.7% for the time component. The bottom half of the tool refers to more what we call material costs. So anything like fuel, insurance, maintenance, anything that's not wage related. And we took that divided by the total wages to get what we call the material component, which is in line 7, that 15%. And so our hypothetical total transportation component would be the addition of those two percentages together.
This is Chris. I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
Line 6, total meaningful day DSP wages is what we're dividing or factoring the non-wage transportation cost. Should that not be total unbillable or total billable as opposed to total? I mean, we've taken the fixed cost in the transportation component, and have we adjusted it for the fact that you can't bill for X number of hours a day, or are we just factoring that in at a percentage of total wages? You would think that it would be a factor of billable wages, not total wages.
So
Yeah,
I think
I would add to that, Chris.
Go ahead.
This is Maria, that yeah, I don't think this calculation is right if it's intended to be what you would include in the BRIC. That the upper box, you should be dividing or taking those DSP transportation non-billable hours over the billable hours. And then similarly, the transportation, the non-wage transportation cost should be over the billable wages in order to get you back to, you know, a total GL that foots. So I think this calculation is understating the percentage if it's intended to apply in the BRIC.
And if it's not intended to apply in the BRIC, how would you then tweak it to apply to the BRIC?
Yeah, so we can take that under consideration. I believe in the BRIC, the intent there is to have the wage be the basis for everything, and so we've identified splitting out the billable and non-billable time. In the wage being kind of that starting point, it's not necessarily just the billable wage. There are other components in there, for example, training or transportation that are then added onto that wage as an additional supplement. And so the intent there, at least in my current understanding, is that that would represent kind of a total wage rather than just a billable wage as a starting point, which is why we're using kind of that total wage as a denominator here so that it's on a consistent basis. But that's something that we can take under consideration and see if we're applying that appropriately.
Yeah, and Chris, I'm happy to share the math offline, but I can yeah, illustrate how it may not foot back to your total GL. So.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. We'll welcome any input information that's helpful in utilizing this information.
So keeping that in mind, when we look at the next slide here, all we have on this slide is the time component that was calculated in the first section of the data collection tool. And so each letter across from left to right represents a provider. And then the percentages are calculated time component percentage, which is just that non-billable hours divided by the total DSP hours. The next slide shows the same set of providers, but we're just mapping the material component that we calculated in the bottom section of the data collection tool, which is the non-wage transportation cost divided by the total wages. And so we just wanted to show each component and its distribution separately, but when we look at the next slide here, we'll see the combination of both, where we stack the time component plus the material component for the same set of providers to get their total transportation. And we see across the providers, we saw an average of 39.6% in the 2019 meaningful day data.
So Leslie, it looks like, are there 20 providers then that went into this calculation? Is that?
That's correct. And that's
through,
just, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask if you, had outliers that you removed or, just why there's only 20.
Yes, so we had some considerations for the outliers. We really looked at there were some providers where we noticed some providers were showing over 1,000% in those outliers, but we try to keep as many points as possible. And again, keeping in mind that this is just the providers that we received up till July 20th.
Okay, so you capped it at 80 and minimum of 10?
We didn't necessarily cap it at a minimum amount. What we did was we looked at what the majority of providers were sharing, and we took out the major outliers on the top end that we noticed. So for instance, like I said, there were providers that were over 1,000%, for instance. And so to help even out the distribution, we cut off the bottom end with the same amount of providers, if that makes sense.
Maria, we can, again, consistent with the staffing ratio, we can provide the specifics of how we're excluding or making those decisions to include, as we start diving into this a little bit more and have our full data set. Sounds like that may be very helpful to have that information present.
Yep, it would be. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll make sure to follow up with the details on that. But again, these were preliminary findings and we haven't finished vetting out like what is an appropriate outlier or not. And so again, these are just very preliminary findings we wanted to share with you as soon as possible.
Leslie, this is Karen Adams-Gilchrist.
Sure.
I guess a piece that would also be concerning is that we have 20 providers that completed these components. And the most common component data elements that was left out was line 3 and line 5, which would say to me that we really have to be concerned that the 20 that did complete this, that there are some assumptions being made in those ones that did complete it and the data that you're using that could easily be errors in that data, considering that these were the most common elements that was left out of the data collection at all. Does that make sense?
Not necessarily that only 20 filled these out. There were a lot more providers that did, but we had to, because of those concerns around data and the errors that there were, we had removed some of those providers where we had those data concerns. So what's left on here is those providers that we see as that we believe to be reasonable responses, and that their data aligned with what we've been seeing in the comments provided from and feedback provided from providers.
Yeah, okay. My concern would be that a lot of people didn't include this data because it was too difficult to collect and it was difficult to figure out how to collect it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've heard that feedback, and we really understand the lift that it was and the efforts that providers did to provide this data to us. And so we want to make sure that we include as many as possible, and to make sure that we try to make as many considerations as possible based on the feedback we've received.
Thank you, Leslie.
Absolutely. So if we go on to the next slide, we did the same process for the projection data. So in that blue, you see the time component that we calculated. In orange, we see the material component. You'll notice there's a few more providers on here. This graph does not represent the same set of providers as the other one. These are different providers, or some of them might overlap, but like for instance, A on this slide does not compare to A on the other slide, if that makes sense. But when we put all the providers together in the same way we calculated the previous chart, for the projection data, we get an average of 44.3% across the providers. Again, this is just for meaningful day. We did the same exercise for all of the subgroups that we asked for. So looking on the next slide, this is just the results of the comparison of the 2019 data, which is on the left, and the projected data for each of these subgroups on the right. If we go to the next slide, we'll have those numbers there for you. And so for each subgroup, so for instance, CDS, we saw in the 2019 populated data, we see an average of 37.8% specific to CDS. And then the projected data is 42.5%. Across the top there is what's currently built into the rate model for transportation. And so we do see that the 2019 experience and the projected data is slightly higher than what is currently built into the rate model. And that's a consideration we're making as we continue to analyze the data and have that internal discussion with the state. And I just wanted to emphasize again that this is considered preliminary. We still have some providers to fold in, and we still have those considerations around the outliers and data quality that you have brought up today.
Leslie,
Honestly,
don't forget the calculation itself too. The point Maria and I were trying to make in reference to that component of it. I mean, clearly it looks like it's starting to support what we've been saying all along, which is transportation is not where it needs to be. If you factor, if Maria and I are correct in our assumptions, then that number is going to be even significantly higher than the 42. How do we move forward? If that number comes out to where where it is now, or higher than it is, how do we fix the rate now?
So we're going to talk about next steps in the next slide, but before we move on to that, I just wanted to point out, like, we did include the total percentage for all meaningful day, but as we know, we don't have all meaningful day in the rates, so that's just there for full transparency on our results. But that's a very good point, Chris. And so if there aren't any questions on the actual results themselves, we can move on and talk through the next steps.
Can I just ask, just a quick, I don't know if it's a question or a statement. Employment is a huge swing, and so maybe just something for the employment first work group to also just really focus in on here. And if we have 22% built into the rate and providers are showing 42%, and I do think those are even low, it kind of would reinforce some of the concerns that many of us have about how we're truly acting as if we are an employment first state if we're not willing to create the model that works best. So just a thought there.
Yeah, thank you for the feedback. And we have been focused on CDS and day habilitation since that's the fiscal year 24 priorities. But like you said, we wanted to include that data so that we can put that under consideration when we talk about employment services in the future. Any other questions around the results? Okay, so we look to the next slide. So this is the timeline that we shared in the prior RAG meeting. We're just resharing to level set our current step in the process. We've collected the data. We're in the process of completing our data analytics, and we're going to have internal discussions with the state around the options for any potential adjustments to meaningful day, what we're going to do next, given the results of the analyses that we're performing. Once we are able to have that discussion with the state on different options and what the various next steps are, we will share the results in the next RRAG meeting for discussion in August. Any questions on what the next steps are? Great. I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
All right. Let me find my place in the slide deck. So as Leslie said, we'll be having internal discussions on the options for the DAHAB rates informed by the data collection results once the additional providers have been incorporated and more data quality analysis has happened. As Leslie shared, we're planning on presenting those options and having more in-depth discussion in the August 19th RAG meeting. After that meeting, the state will then make final policy decisions. We may, before making those final policy decisions, want to have more discussion and gather more feedback. But that's generally the direction that we're headed next. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just a reminder that all meeting materials will be made available through the designated DDA webpage for the advisory group. And can we go to the next slide? Thank you again for attending and your commitment to this work. All of your feedback is really helpful, especially as we're kind of standing up this process from scratch. So everything that you all had to say is definitely appreciated. And we look forward to continuing our discussion on Friday, August 19th from 12:30 to 2:30.
Jennifer, it's Chris. Real quick, one last request.
Sure.
The group has requested, I think 2 times already, this would be the 3rd, to have access to the unredacted, or the redacted, excuse me, fiat data. And I don't think we've received an official response from the state of whether we would have access to that information or not.
Right. I think I received an email from Laura yesterday with that request, and we will have some internal discussion and get something back to you definitely before the next meeting. We'll talk about what we can potentially share to make sure we're all on the same page.
Do you just
definitely give you a response?
Sorry, Jennifer, just to clarify, the email yesterday was
Sure.
about application data. I think the fiat data was an earlier request, as Chris said.
Oh, okay. Okay. Got it. So we will talk about both then and make sure that we're being responsive to both requests.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There are no other questions or comments. I think we will adjourn for today. Thank you again, everyone, and we will see you next month.